My name is Jim Doty. I'm the founder and director of CCARE. What I want to go over with you a little bit is sort of my view of this, and then talk a little bit about history and why I think we're here and what we hope to accomplish. Before I do that, though, I know Emma so graciously thanked myself and Mahim, but really Emma, our associate director, also puts her heart and soul into this. And for Emma, as well as Matt, Joel, Emiliana, and the others who've been intimately involved, Cliff, and all of our faculty, I really appreciate your continued dedication to this work and support of CCARE. So maybe we can give them a hand. When this journey began, it began out of my own interest in this topic because I was always fascinated by this paradox of why people who have nothing see people suffering and give everything. And oftentimes we see people who have everything, and for whatever reason we can't figure out people who are in positions of power, people who are wealthy, people who have influence. Either they don't see, they're not aware, they choose not to see. Why don't they get more involved? And that's really the challenge, I think, of our time, is to think about this topic of how can we use the knowledge that we have gained through science to, frankly, create the value proposition for engagement. It's not just engagement individually, it's engagement as a society, and how do we bring the work that we're doing or will do to all of these different domains, whether those domains be education, whether they be healthcare, whether they be civic government. How do we change the paradigm of how our society functions so that we no longer view our community as just a small group of people, which from an evolutionary perspective, of course, is how we evolved, but how do we enlarge that view of what community is and further promote this view of interdependence. Because I think we all appreciate that unless we look at the world that way, we look at everyone as our brothers and our sisters, we cannot go forward as a society, and we will destroy ourselves. So the work you are engaging in, the work that you're going to engage in, it could have profound impact on this world, and never underestimate the power of one. So many people look at the world and they sit there and they say, my God, there's so much suffering. How can I do anything? I'm just one person. I love Apple. But the fact of the matter is everything starts with one. And if you look at yourself as a person who has potentially unlimited power, and I stole that from Tony Robbins, who has really within themselves an immense amount of power to create change, it will always guide you through. Never underestimate that. Never underestimate the interaction you might have with one person to stimulate them in their own lives, to change their lives and the lives of people around them. Before we can do that, though, and I think it's commonly said, whether it's by the Dalai Lama or from us who've stolen that from him, none of us, though, can affect change or create peace in the world unless we have peace within ourselves. And that's one of the challenges, too, is how do we create techniques, interventions, applications, where we can give individuals those things that will allow them to find peace within themselves so that then they can go forward and give peace to others and relieve the suffering of others. Because one of the things that prohibits people or limits people is this, in some ways, egocentric view that their suffering is somehow worse than everyone else's suffering. And when this rumination takes place, it prevents them from actually seeing the world. And generally speaking, and I'm a neurosurgeon in my day job, I see tragedy, horrible tragedy, every day. And but the fact of the matter is that out of tragedy can come incredible growth, incredible wisdom, and actually can give you the strength and the tools actually to move forward. So it's our job, I think, and our task is, while neuroscience is fascinating and wonderful, it's all just an intellectual exercise unless we can take that and translate this into tools that can help other people. So that's really what our goal is today. Some of you who are geeks, probably all of you are geeks, but a different type of geek. Tim's the exception. But within the computer science geek world, we have these things called hackathons. And we're going to do a compassion-a-thon. And that's really what your task is for the attendees, is to, number one, hopefully, while you're here, create a community that will be a lasting community of friendships and relationships across domains that will allow you, while you're here, to also explore interaction with some of your colleagues here to perhaps take ideas that you've thought of, ideas that have been floating around in your head, and then with the aid of some of our faculty or some of your fellow colleagues here, come up with some interesting ideas that could potentially be paradigm shifting. And then after that, we will pick a few of those and give a prize, and then ultimately, hopefully, have that prize awarded to you by the Dalai Lama when he visits us in Stanford in February of next year. So that should be really exciting. No pressure. And those who fail will have to stand in front of him and tell him why. So.
We all win.
Actually, you know, it's interesting when you say we all win. Have any of you heard of the Compassion Games? A friend of mine, John Raymer, is doing this, and it's interesting because there's also something called the Compassionate Cities Program. Are any of you aware of that? So the idea is to have a competition to see who is the most compassionate. And it's interesting because we had just had an event with the Dalai Lama and others in Louisville, and Louisville challenged Seattle, where John is, and started the Compassion Games, saying that they were the most compassionate city. And then what happened is the mayor of Louisville and a team of people flew to Seattle to help Seattle beat them. So, so that is true compassion, and that's really getting it. Just to also mention, and if some of you are interested, you can talk to me about it later, is one of the things that I have been working on for the last several months with a small team of non-scientists, thank God, is something called the World Compassion Initiative. And it's really has brought together some very prominent individuals to, again, look at this field and some of these different domains and all the empiric science that's associated with them, and how do we create a platform, if you will, that will act as an aggregator, a curator, a perhaps creator, and a catalyst to support what I call the age of compassion. You know, we had the age of enlightenment, and that went for well over 100 years. I think we're now in the early stages of the decades-long age of compassion, and it's how do we support these little fits and starts that are happening in different parts of the world, in different domains, to create a platform where they can engage in community and support this whole endeavor. And that's to culminate in 2015 with something which is called the World Compassion Festival. And His Holiness Desmond Tutu, I'll name a bunch of religious leaders just to get you all excited, Sri Sri Ravi Shankar, Amma, who else is there? All those types of people. Anyway, they're all committed to this, a number of the Nobel Peace Laureates, and the idea is to have an event, and I mentioned the 100 Compassionate City, or the Compassionate Cities. We're partnering with them to create 100 compassionate cities around the world by that time. And it's not just saying you're a compassionate city, it's actually integrating this into how your city functions in all these different domains I mentioned. And then at the time of the festival, have 100 compassionate cities that each participates in their own compassion festival, with the idea to bring especially youth to service to others. And the idea is for where the World Compassion Festival is going to be held, the home city, is to bring 100,000 youth to service to those problems that are greatest facing our humanity. And it gets back to the same issue of each of us has within us the power to be extraordinarily powerful. And to look at these different domains, whether it's nuclear weapons, whether it's ecological destruction, whether it's global warming, whether it's women empowerment issues, all of these domains, to create a community around them so that people can work at the local, national, international level to affect change. So it's really exciting stuff. I'm happy to share more about that with you. And I know that's boring compared to this conference, but this is certainly part of that effort. So without further ado, we're going to start. And could the rest of Daryl, are you in this? Why don't you come out and up here? Our first topic today is, we cannot go forward unless we have a definition of what we're talking about, and unless we have an overview and a construct from which those definitions arise. And we're really fortunate today, and I'm not going to go over all of their biographies. So we have Cliff Sarin, who's moderating this panel, Stephanie Brown, extraordinaire, Emiliana, extraordinaire, a new mother, and Daryl Cameron, who is a new father, recently married, and has a new job. So this,
It's been a busy year.
yes. So these individuals are going to go over this. I'm actually going to sit there and sit back and let them do it, since we have 4 chairs, and they're much more educated about this topic than I. Again, thank you so much for being here, and it's really a pleasure and an honor to be with you. Thank you.
All right, while they're getting that set up, let me just introduce myself. I'm Stephanie Brown. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at Stony Brook University. It's probably pointless to go back through my educational history. I'm happy to talk to you about that at a different point. I did get my degree in social psychology. There are 3 things, I guess, I want to tell you about myself that are at least help you remember who I am. One is that my first publication occurred when I was 18 months old. I was the subject of my father's dissertation on potty training. And I attribute most of my problems to the very severe behavioristic kind of approaches where things like extinction. I mean, imagine your parents just staring at you and not giving you any responses. The other thing is that the other thing is you should know, because my parents are behaviorists, I grew up very anti-compassion in its scientific sense, thinking everything was reducible to what you could get for yourself. So in graduate school, I worked with Bob Cialdini. I don't know if any of you know who he is, but he had the idea that everything we did to help others was because it relieved our own negative states, and because we have a desire to get more stuff for ourselves, and that there was no such thing as altruism. So Dan Batson, who studies empathy and says we care for others because we're genuinely interested in them, I argued absolutely not. And that was the subject of my first 3 years in graduate school. The third thing I wanted to tell you is that when I did my dissertation work and stumbled upon data that I just couldn't reconcile very well with Bob's parsimonious account of human behavior, I lost my advisor over proposing an alternative, which is that we can actually suppress our self-interest sometimes in the interest of promoting others, and I did that from an evolutionary perspective. And we're on good terms now, but I'm here to tell you that it's very good to follow your own path. And I want to say something again before I start about why you're here and how important your presence is. Everything we want to do in terms of creating compassionate communities or putting humanism back into our world to try to save the planet, whatever it might be, it gets legs and leverage from science. And that when we, and it's not just a rhetorical point, it's not just, we validate movements that have been going on for, for all time. It's not that. It's that science pursues mysteries, and some mysteries exist, like how do you actually unlock these feelings in others? Because I'm here to tell you, teaching medical students, if you tell them to be compassionate, they'll tell you where to shove it. It's not that easy. It's not that intuitive, and that's where you come in. And there are pieces, puzzle pieces, there are mysteries to be solved, and through the work that we're all doing together, I mean, this, some ways you could look at this like the birth of a field where all the seeds were there for a long time, and a lot of people were wanting to push science in this direction. There are historical reasons why that was rejected, especially in the United States. And I won't go into that, but I want you to know that what you're doing, I think, is, I want to echo Dr. Doty's point that this is really a paradigm shifting kind of work that you'll be involved with. So anyway, thank you for coming to something like this, and it's a pleasure to be here. Well, I'll just start with telling you what compassion is in the way I'm defining compassion. So this is something that I think a lot of people would agree with, but you're going to hear a lot more about conceptual definitions of compassion. But I think it has three elements. One is noticing need or suffering in others. All right, what is compassion? So one way to define it is that it's a way of responding to need in others by noticing the need. And this is the psychologist in me, having the motivation to relieve the need, and then engaging in the actual behaviors that are going to help to relieve the need. And that's how I will talk about it today. Now, as I sort of alluded to already, there's the scientific approach to this question has been to suggest that we actually meet others' needs to get more things for ourselves, to preserve a relationship, because we need relationships. So we want to make sure our partner doesn't leave us. So everything we do is to keep our partner happy and keep them together with us. Bob Cialdini's work, we want to relieve our negative states. We experience distress, we want to make our distress, our guilt go away. That's why we help. Or we want to look good to others. We want to be the guy who gives the ride to the airport, or, you know, is the magnanimous person who pays for the check after dinner. In economics, you see similar, if not identical, assumptions, which is that we're rationally self-interested. Our economic activity reflects what we are going to do to maximize our benefits and minimize our costs. And when we're transferring our wealth or our resources to others, it's with the understanding that it's because that is going to benefit our sense of who we are and what's important to us, right? So the idea is that, yes, people do give, but the business who gives the charitable donation is also the business who gets the most business. So it's, again, everything is reduced to what the individual ultimately maximizes, which is pleasure, benefits, and minimizing costs and pain. In evolutionary biology, we also see similar assumptions where the goal of benevolent action is actually thought to be to pass on more of one's own genes, right? That we're actually going to benefit our genetic success by what we do to help others. Now, what's a very important point to point out with evolutionary biology, that doesn't actually mean that we're not very motivated to care for others. Okay, so this is an ultimate level of analysis. It's saying that when you see individuals who are caring for others, we can say it's because it's benefiting your genes ultimately, right? But that doesn't say how we care or what we feel when we care for others. Now, even though it's agnostic with respect to motivation, typically in evolutionary biology, you see those same sort of assumptions of self-interest that kind of come in, which is, although Dawkins says, you know, it doesn't preclude altruistic or compassionate motivation, but let's talk about how survival of the fittest really is at work here. And so what we do is we take that notion and we decide, okay, individuals in their individual lives are trying to maximize their survival without considering that the name of the game in evolution is to reproduce common genes and to raise them to be reproducers themselves. What does that mean? You can think about it differently. You can think about how much compassion and helping is required to raise helpless infants to reproductive age, right? You can think about it different. That whole difference hasn't really been looked at, though. That idea that helping has to be part of the picture was originally, well, probably even before this, but Kropotkin in the late 1800s, early 1900s, talked about something called mutual aid, and it was an alternative to survival of the fittest. The idea that the organisms that helped one another are going to out-reproduce the organisms that are out for themselves. That was pretty much dismissed, and only now do we see that those kinds of ideas being resurrected. So, what's missing in these analyses? A genuine concern for the well-being of another person. And so we can think about the science of compassion as a corrective to say, you know what, let's go ahead and say there is a genuine concern for the well-being of another. We can't prove anything, just like we can't prove gravity exists, right? But what we can do is we can make that assumption and see where it takes us. Do we understand more than we would without that assumption? So again, the evolutionary background, it necessitates compassionate motivation in the case of parenting, right? It necessitates that there's going to be giving the resources of the self to another individual over prolonged periods of time in the absence of reciprocity at high cost, even sacrificing one's life. That was necessary. That's a requirement of evolutionary biology for humans to be around today. You know, someone's helping those helpless infants. And something hardwired, something shaped by evolution created that motivational system to do that. And now we're talking about the fact that we are dependent on one another for survival and reproduction in a variety of ways. So the idea that we can tap into that motivation to help others also has reproductive benefits, whether it's our sister who's in a position to take care of our kids if something happens to us, or our coworker who's in a position to take care of our kids because we're friends with our coworker if something happens to us, right? So when we create these interdependencies, we all of a sudden now see how there are benefits to our genes from helping one another. So these ideas are reflected in a variety of theories. I'm not going to go into them in detail. I'm going to tell you they differ on one basic level. If you've heard of group selection, how many have heard of group selection? Okay, there's a bit of a war between group selection and individual level or genetic, gene-centric models of selection. And I don't want to explain too much. I'll tell you my bias is that I don't think you need to decide that the most adaptive groups are going to pass on more genes. I don't think group selection, for those of you who know about it, I don't think you need group selection to account for genuine concern for others who are not related to you. And for anybody who wants to talk about that in detail, I'm happy to talk to you about it. But these theories basically describe how in the world it can be adaptive for your genes to be nice to others, to help, to invest, to give your resources away. Because the trick is, the minute from an evolutionary perspective that you think about all this giving, all this compassion, what are you doing? You're setting yourself up to be exploited. And so the entire reason that we've assumed human nature is selfish, right? Because all the altruistic people wouldn't be around today. They'd be giving their resources to their competitors. They'd be taken advantage of. So these kinds of theories describe situations in which you're protected against the threat of exploitation. All right, so how is it we can give in ways that don't compromise the integrity of the giver so much that the giver can't survive and reproduce, or at least reproduce? All right, so that's really the problem that evolutionary theories are trying to tackle, is how to overcome the problem of exploitation. So kin selection, it's that we give to people we're related to. Reciprocal altruism, we give to people who will give back to us. Stakeholder theory is that we give if we're interdependent for common goals related to survival and reproduction, then giving can't be exploited. Selective investment theory, that is the same idea. If we're interdependent, our giving can't be exploited, but actually, one step further than that, we create social bonds with one another that then that emerge from interdependence that help us suppress our self-interest and direct resources towards others. So it combines the ultimate and the proximate level of analysis. Commitment, the idea that if you don't follow through on what you say you're going to do, like I'm going to harm you or blow you up if you do something to my relatives. If we don't have these irrational programs to get us to suppress our self-interest, then other people can take advantage of it. It's a little bit more directed towards commitment being a safe space to give in the moment and not as much about our the reason that we give. And then group selection and derivatives of reciprocal altruism, that the people who give the most are getting the most mates. The people who give the most are going to be the targets of reciprocity from other people. So again, these are all saying, how is it that giving would have benefited our genes in ways that don't get us exploited? Does that seem like pretty clear? All right. And I think that is where I wanted to leave off.
That's great. So rather than reserve all questions for the end, I want to take just a few minutes after each speaker to see if there are any immediate questions that arise. Because if you keep all of our different worlds in your head, you may lose the thread.
So, I saw the title, Major.
That was
the wrong.
that's the
Oh,
that's
wrong
another.
title.
Wondering where the major was.
I have 7 talks to give, and that was the wrong talk. So.
Yeah.
You were talking.
Can you say your name, please?
I'm Martina. I was wondering, you were talking about like compassion towards another person, and I think like if we consider interconnectedness, it might be important if it's also towards like animals and nature, like in a broader sense.
Absolutely. And in fact, when the word interdependence is used, it's not at all restrictive to it being other humans. Like some of the ideas that I developed came from watching certain hunter-gatherer groups who have interdependence with pets, where they will risk starvation to feed the family pet, but that family pet will also alert them to danger. So yes, it can be directed cross species. Yes, it can be more than just 2 people. It could be in an entire group. Yes, it could be even idealized. So maybe we think we have interdependence with our political leaders, our president. Maybe we think we have interdependence with concepts of God or spiritual power. So interdependence is really in the eye of the beholder. And all that matters from an evolutionary perspective is our brain picks up a cue somehow that would have been typically associated with interdependent circumstances, however you want to define it.
Yeah. These 3, and then.
Okay.
So
Yes.
Stephanie, you mentioned, I think you set up a dichotomy towards the end of your talk between group selection theories. And
Joel, you're on a short leash here.
Okay. I'll make it really quick.
There's not a dichotomy because there's no disagreement. It's really about the strength of selection.
Yeah.
And my point is, I don't think you need group selection to account for. So a lot of group selection people, without explaining what it is, I feel really bad having this discussion because
We can have it offline too.
if you don't know, but let me just make the key point that what happens is there's a bit of a backwards working that because we see so much compassion and altruism directed in humans to people who are not related to one another, that is proof for the idea that processes that selected for better groups would have shaped these sort of mechanisms, these psychological mechanisms for empathy. And so I'm just suggesting that I don't think you need to invoke these other selective forces. You could still use selection at the level of the gene to get to this rich set of
And I
psychological.
think
So this is where we're
we'll have it
going to.
offline. We'll have it
It is a compassionate act, I hope, on my part.
I'm really sorry. I can't cover evolution without saying there's.
And there are 2 more, and let's see if we can be quick about
Yeah,
this.
my name is Peter Ann. I'm interested in the fact that you prefaced
the theories by saying, and what you're saying in terms of a scientific history, and just wondering, the extent to which you address perhaps philosophical and metaphysical attempts to explain this.
So what you saw here is not philosophical background is not part of this, because the discussion is usually whether altruism exists, and that it's hard to answer your question, because the scientific pursuit kind of has to take a stance and say, okay, this is the way it's going to be. We're either going to assume it doesn't exist and then test that, or we're going to assume it does exist and test that. But the only philosophical piece in what I'm presenting is that I would say we can never know in a given instance what the kind of motivation is that's driving an individual. That's not an empirical question. To be able to look inside the human being and mind and know where
That
everything's
doesn't
coming.
make it not a question.
It doesn't make it not a question.
Last question
Yeah, I'll be
on
really
that.
quick. My name's Amy. I'm just wondering, from an evolutionary perspective, are you looking for something that is kind of a global explanation of compassionate behaviour? Or is it possible that those competing theories could better explain behaviour in some cultures than others?
So these theories are designed to be cross-cultural.
Yeah.
Some of them, though, take the cultural differences into account and suggest that, like in one kind of culture, interdependence may be fostered by the community, and survival outcomes might be linked naturally by the environment. In other cultures, like in the United States, we're explicit about putting people in competition with each other for these survival. So the theories would allow for that variance to come in and be explained. They're designed, though, to be universals, not just for humans, but also for non-humans. And remember, they're not so much a theory of compassion or the motivation as much as they are to say theories of, well, how could people be like this if it's so bad for our genes to survive? So they're saying, okay, how can we explain this away? So the theories they can all work together. We can talk about different levels of analysis. They're not really in competition with one another.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now we will have Liliana tell us a little bit about her path.
Good morning. Thank you so much. First, it's an extraordinary privilege to be here. This is such a wonderful group of people. I'm inspired and motivated. Always a student. One of my favorite things about teaching are the new insights, questions, reminders about the assumptions that I make in my sort of long career of thinking things are supposed to be one way. And when you have new people thinking about it or presenting ideas, it's a wonderful experience of relearning. And I hope you'll give me that by asking hard questions and pointing out things that you think are worth thinking about more deeply. I'd like to thank Dr. Doty for his lifelong commitment to the spreading of compassion in the world. Is a unique and inspiring human being. So
Can we
thank
call
you for
him
that.
Jim?
Jim.
No, I prefer Dr.
Yeah. I'd like to thank Stephanie for that just really, really helpful foundation. That was super interesting and important for us to all think about the sort of theoretical basis whereby we could start to think about compassion and what it means. And with that, I'm going to move forward with how I think about compassion. My background is as a cognitive neuroscientist, and I originally studied back in the day when I first started speaking with Cliff, how emotions and cognitions sort of intersected. What happened when you were feeling really irritated if you had to make a difficult decision? And it was arising out of this assumption historically in Western cultures that emotions are the enemy of reason, that emotions are these things we should just kind of like try to only use if we're learning how to play the guitar or recite poetry, but we should never use them when we're making important decisions or we're thinking critically about the world. And I just felt like that was a disservice. And it's a huge, ethos around how we think about ourselves as humans. And again, I think it's just not necessarily true. After putting people into a little booth, sticking electrodes on their heads, showing them awful pictures, and then forcing them to do really hard tasks. Yeah, exactly. I gravitated towards the opportunity to study positive emotions, things like love of humanity, compassion, gratitude, awe, a more sort of fun and interesting newer field. And in that path, I started to try to understand compassion. And much of my experience was sort of dictated in an anecdotal way by becoming a parent myself and realizing I, at a crossroads, had a plan after my PhD to go take a job at a nice lab, which was close to Cliff, and I had it all scheduled. My baby was going to be born. 6 weeks later, I was going to start the job. I was going to hire a nanny who was going to stay with the baby at home while I went off to my job, overachieving, highly academically driven, and my whole world shifted when this new infant entered my sphere. I had absolutely no capacity to hand it off to a new adult who I didn't know well and drive an hour and a half and be gone for 8 hours and come back and whatever I thought I was going to do. I just had this real misunderstanding about the humanity and the force behind this caregiving, nurturance orientation. So that also sort of drove me to try to look at this area, look at this part of the human experience. I work at UC Berkeley with Dr. Keltner. Currently, I'm I used to be the associate director of CCARE. I noticed that my thing says CCARE, which I really appreciate. You guys are so sweet. I'm currently the science director at the Greater Good Science Center, which is a little bit like CCARE, but the North Bay version of it. And yeah. I've always lived in Berkeley, so it was it's hard to get me out of my hometown. So anyway, I'd like to talk a little bit about what we did to try to study compassion from a social psychological perspective, from an affective science perspective, and break down all the little parts that factor into an experience of compassion. Because really, if I were to say, I'm going to take you, put you in the booth, and find out what happens in your body when you have compassion, it's almost an impossible proposal, because a lot of little things make up an experience of compassion. So we'll talk a little bit about that. I'll talk about what I think is an essential but not sufficient process that contributes to compassion, and that's empathy, right? The experience of feeling something when you encounter another person's emotion. The problem with empathy, in terms of considering it an analog to compassion, is that it's not as specific as compassion. You can have empathic amusement, right? Ever walked into a room where 5 people are laughing hysterically and you start laughing too for no good reason? You don't know the joke, right? Maybe they're laughing at you, but yet you're laughing too, right? So yeah, empathy is broad, right? It's pan-affective. It doesn't have to do solely with suffering, right? Compassion is really a response to suffering, okay? Here, this is obviously, maybe you've heard about literature about how we empathically yawn. Empathy really comes from, and the science behind our understanding of empathy comes from sort of mirroring, right? These primates who were taught to do physical tasks with their arms, and scientists were measuring from electrodes on the motor cortex what neurons, what populations of neurons were controlling this kind of movement, and they noticed that yes, these neurons did a certain very complex, fascinating, sequence of firing when the organism or when the animal made these movements, but they also noticed that they fired when the animals watched the experimenter show them the movements. So wow. Right? Our brains are exquisitely sensitive and respond in a way that is consistent with the movement, whether or not we're making it, right? So empathy, that's the empathy literature.
That was actually triggered. There was a finding that was serendipitous when the experimenter walked in the lab with an ice cream cone.
There you go.
And the monkey couldn't move to reach it, but saw him.
Saw the other, yeah, and so he wanted, well, that's interesting. I didn't know that part of it. Thanks, Cliff. This other little cartoon, can I call you back, Ed? I'm in the moment here, okay? So another piece of compassion is the extent to which people have good relationships with their emotional experiences, right? I don't want to say they're good emotion regulators, and we can figure that out over the course of the next few days. I don't want to say they have good control over their emotions, because remember, I come from this path of trying to bring evidence to break down the idea that emotions are bad for thinking, right? Emotions, I think, are really important for thinking, and they inform thoughts and decisions in very useful ways. So having our emotions, but not freaking out about them, right? Not ruminating ad infinitum about what they might mean later is a very valuable experience. And part of having that relationship to our emotions, we have begun to start to understand, comes from having a certain degree of mindfulness. And there are people in the room who study this more than I do. And I look forward to hearing them talk about it. Compassion has something to do with how we think about other people, right? Do we think about other people as just like us? Or do we think about other people as somehow intrinsically and inherently different, right? You are an altogether different creature from me, thus I will sort of tune my empathic sensitivity down a little bit. I'm not going to really resonate with you because you're not me, right? And we see this in popular tragedies, right? I mean, not to invoke something sensationalist, but the Florida Trayvon Martin case, right? You can say it's all about gun control, but a lot of it is about lack of interdependence. It's about seeing someone as a threat for no good reason, right? You are different than me, and I'm going to make a lot of assumptions about your relationship to me based on that assumption that we're fundamentally different and you represent a threat. So this cartoon is a guy seeing a transient who is asking for money, and he's willing to give it when the transient holds up the mirror because suddenly, oh, you're just like me. And so I'm willing to share some of my resources. Another is how we think about the people around us, right? So this is the classic bystander issue, where you've got somebody laid out on the ground and all these people, he doesn't really need help, he'll be okay, I'm sure someone else will handle it, I guess he's drunk, right? How do we think about ourselves, our responsibilities, the people around us, and what's happening in a particular situation? And I want to argue that all of these contribute to our momentary experience of compassion. And furthermore, to our trait level experience of compassion. And I'm going to sort of let that segue into my next little discussion. Is compassion an emotion or a trait? Right? Is it something that happens right now because you're confronted with something that arises, that motivates a certain response, and then dissipates? Right? I'd say, yeah, it is. Is compassion a way you relate to the world? Is it how you think about people? Is it your general disposition towards others? I'm sorry, yes, it is, right? I'm going to put up a few dichotomies here and just tell you again and again that they don't hold, okay? You're not going to succeed in saying compassion is only a trait or compassion is only an emotion. And there are interesting questions and interesting problems to ask thinking about it in both ways, okay? Is compassion negative or positive, right? I've had this argument multiple times with my mentor, Dacher Keltner, who insists it's a positive emotion. And me, coming from a neuroscience perspective and looking at empathy and what happens when you are in the presence of somebody else's pain, that pain networks in your own in your own mind, right? And in, pain responses in your body flare up, right? You're feeling something that is not joy and pleasure when you encounter someone else's pain, right? In that first moment, right? So is it negative? It goes on, right? How do you relate to that? Then do you anticipate helping? Do you anticipate some positive influence or response to helping, perhaps? Is it something that's meaningful and beneficial to your social and personal well-being? Absolutely. So it's not negative, it's not positive, right? There's reasons to think of it in both ways. Does compassion associated with being weak or strong? right? I'd like to use the words vulnerable, right? And, well, I guess I'll stick with strong, right? At some level, it's both, right? To be compassionate, you need to be vulnerable. You need to be willing to open your heart to the people around you, to be receptive to what's happening in their lives, and to not focus solely on what's going on in your own self, right? Can't be so strong, I'm so tough, I don't have to like focus on them. On the same token, being vulnerable requires strength, requires confidence. Is compassion an affective process, or is it a higher cognitive process? Is it a decision that comes from lots of thinking and not ruminating, but deciding, contemplating, holding things in working memory and attending in a specific way? Or is it something more relying on your affective circuitry, your amygdala, your midline cortices, right? Guess what? If you try to survey the neuroscience literature on compassion, you're going to get answers to both of those that suggest it's either or, right? The people who are interested in attention find answers in the realm of attention and cognition and thinking. People who are interested in affect find answers in affective structures, right? So it's a complex, multifaceted entity, and there are reasons to think about it that way, and this is why we need all of us in the room. This is why there isn't one person who's figured compassion out. Oh, I got the compassion switch, or I've got the compassion brain area, or I've got the compassion body signal. It's not. Okay, there's multiple things happening, and they're all sort of intersecting. Is compassion self-interested or purely altruistic? There's reasons why compassion is really good for oneself, and there's reasons why compassion are really good for forging long-term meaningful bonds that in your community. I'm struck by the sort of medical literature, which whenever I read a paper that says physician empathy is so important or physician compassion is so important, it's always about why it's good for patients. It's always about why patients benefit, outcomes are better, and never about why it's good for the physician, right? And when I talk, and this happens occasionally, I go to Kaiser and I talk to a room full of doctors, that's what I sit there and say. And I don't get as much shove it up your you-know-what, right? Because they're like, really? This is going to help me? This is going to make me feel better? Oh, interesting, right? And this is what we're sort of helping to try to figure out. How can we convey that message? Is compassion a trait, or is it learned? Is it something you're born with? Do you get born with the gene variant for oxytocin that makes you really sensitive and care nurturance oriented? Or do you have parents who wonderfully reinforce these qualities as a consequence of their ideas or your culture? Again, both, right? There's some evidence that certain people have a disposition that makes it easier. It's probably interconnected with their levels of anxiety or sensitivity to the world, which is also another complexity. And obviously, there's an opportunity for culture to really bestow upon individuals the importance or the value of compassion. So now I'm going to take another 3 or 4 minutes to walk you through what we think happens when somebody has an experience of compassion in the moment. So this isn't the trait level compassion. This is, I want to see compassion in a moment and try to capture what goes on. And this is how we lay out all the things that we think go on. Let's see, what evokes compassion? This is coming from an affective science perspective, where there's a specific kind of thing that will be the antecedent. Suffering, vulnerable suffering, right? That's unique. Vulnerable suffering is what makes compassion emerge, right? It's the beginning of compassion. Empathy, which I call this initial physiological response, other people call resonance or emotion contagion. This is the beginning of compassion. This is you feeling something because you confront this suffering. What that feeling means to you, let's wait for that, okay? Let's hold on, right? First, it's you feeling something. And in affective science, we understand emotions by connecting both the physiological response, that feeling, and your understanding or your appraisal of what that response is. I left out a little piece of what empathy also includes. Some people break empathy out into 2 parts. 1 is that feeling, and 2 is some higher understanding of what it means. Okay, so this relies on a different set of neural circuits, higher order circuitry that is involved in expertise, right? Knowing over the course of a lifetime that this configuration of facial muscles means a certain thing when most people make it, right? We understand this through our capacity to learn repeatedly that this face means anger. This face usually means something has happened that has blocked that person's goals, right? So that's an expertise signal. I understand anger and I feel something in my body. That's the beginning of compassion. Now we go through this course of, well, what does it mean to me, right? And how do I relate to it? I'm having this feeling in my body. Is it something that I identify as my own anger or my own distress? I'm also distressed because I see you distressed, and thus I want to get the hell out of here because it bothers me or I'm irritated? Or is it, I have this feeling that is kind of an opportunity to be aroused, which kind of like Superman fuel to help, right? I'm aroused so that I can do something, right? That process of appraising what your physiological response is for is an interesting piece of compassion, and we're interested in looking at that. We'll talk about that more on the Measuring Compassion panel for the person who asked that question. Does that experience, your physiological arousal, allow a sort of parallel engagement of care-nurturance circuitry, this affiliative drive that Stephanie talked about, right? Does that system get to come online, or is there some extent to which these systems are reciprocally activated? And if you're anxious and you identify this as an inconvenience or a stress, you sort of shut down your affiliative care system. There's some data to suggest that that's what happens. So what you do here really matters. How you think about yourself really matters. If you think, shit, I'm useless, nothing I can do here, your relationship to that emotional experience goes down a different track. And Daryl's work really tells a great story about that, and hopefully you'll learn about that, right? Think you can't do anything about it? Really, your compassion sort of gets shut down. Attributions, what do you think about other people? Is the other person a criminal? Is the other person a drug user? There's a wonderful study by Jean Dussetti looking at empathic responses in the brain. People who, looking at pictures of people who had AIDS. And the experimenter said, well, these people got AIDS from an accidental blood transfusion. These people got AIDS from intravenous drug use. And they looked at the signals in the brain, the empathic signals, right? How much did they feel something when the other person, when they looked at these pictures of suffering? If it was a drug user, empathy signals way down, right? If it was an accidental blood transfusion, empathy is high, right? So what we believe about that other person, what we think, what we assume makes a difference, and knowing this is helpful. Do we think of the other person as part of who we are, right? Or do we have a sense of common humanity? And then there's this sort of cost-benefit analysis piece. Should I help? If I help, does it mean anything? Will I be able to make a difference? Are other people already, do I assume that other people are helping? If I assume that other people are helping, maybe I don't care so much and I walk away. The last little part of compassion is the behavior piece, right? And in terms of trying to understand or trying to study compassion, what can we do, right? If we anticipate that our actions will lead to the alleviation of suffering, to the emergence of a positive state, we can, and we have that experience, right? We resonate that as much as we resonate the suffering, right? Oh, I see you laughing. I see you smiling. I see you relieved. I'm relieved too, right? And I don't mean to push the whole motivation towards it's about relieving my own suffering, but I do think that that's a reasonably valuable part of the story, right? I want to walk away from these dichotomies that it's either about the self or it's about others, right? It's pure altruism or pure sort of self-service, right? There's room for both of these kinds of motivation to contribute to the experience and compassion. And there's evidence to suggest that we do feel empathic joy, right? Wonderful research out of University of Oregon, science paper. If you're forced to give some of your hard-earned experimental money to a charity that you chose by a little task that says, yes, you gave this, so you have to give now, you don't have to give now, blah, blah, blah. In the conditions where you have to give now, and it's to a charity, reward circuits in your brain that are the same ones that activate when you earn money yourself light up, okay? So there's a true sense to which we are equipped with mechanisms that drive us to be in the presence of other people who are being relieved or who are in states of pleasure and joy. So that's the end of my little what is compassion, and I'm going to pass the mic to Daryl. Thank you so much.
All right, so hello. So when they put me, so I'm a social psychologist, work at University of Iowa. So this is kind of a grab bag. So, and it does kind of overlap a little bit with what Emiliana talked about. It does discuss some of the philosophical background of compassion, how to define compassion. So this is a whirlwind tour. I thought, but to start us off, I wanted you to look at the following slides just to give you an experiential sense for what you might think compassion might be. And just focus on what you're feeling, how you're thinking, physiological reactions you're having. That's really the worst one for me. I just can't handle that. Now, the feeling you're feeling, I'm sure many of us, you would think about it as sympathy or compassion. And this is an emotion that has a long philosophical history. In the theory of moral sentiments, the Scottish philosopher Adam Smith has this wonderful quote. It's one of my favorite quotes about sympathy and compassion. He says that how selfish soever man may be supposed, there are evidently some principles in his nature which interest him in the fortune of others and render their happiness necessary to him, though he derives nothing from it except the pleasure of seeing it. Of this kind is pity or compassion, the emotion which we feel for the misery of others. This sentiment, like all the other original passions of human nature, is by no means confined to the virtuous and humane. The greatest ruffian, the most hardened violator of the laws of society, is not altogether without it. So it's a beautiful quote. And going back further, Aristotle in the Rhetoric defines what he calls pity, that really means compassion, as an emotion involving three specific cognitive judgments. The first being noticing some kind of severe suffering. The second, noticing some kind of undeserved suffering, so it's blameless. And then finally, the third component is noticing that you share similar life possibilities to the person that is suffering. That could be you in the situation as well. And Martha Nussbaum has nicely kind of updated that stance philosophically. But this is a Science of Compassion conference, so psychologists have taken these philosophical approaches and tried to formalize them into accounts of what compassion might be. Dan Batson's one of the most famous social psychologists of compassion, and he's defined empathic concern, which confusingly means compassion, not empathy, as other-oriented emotion elicited by and congruent with the perceived welfare of someone in need. You see someone in need, you care about improving their welfare, and you want to relieve it somehow. Very straightforward. In a wonderful review by Emiliana, Dr. Keltner, and Jennifer Gates, they define compassion as the feeling that arises in witnessing another's suffering that motivates a desire to help. These are pretty straightforward definitions of compassion, but these are the ones that are cited throughout many subfields of psychology. And this is going to be a little bit repetitive with what Emiliana talked about, but so I'll just kind of go through this pretty quickly. In thinking about what causes compassion, theorists have talked about a few specific components that lead into compassion as an emotional response. The first is that you have to perceive that someone is in need. You have to see the need in question. You have to value the other person's welfare. So you have to actually care about this person's suffering. And this can be modulated by things like blame, whether you think the person is outside the scope of your moral regard, similarity, and self-relevance. Does the person matter to you? Does the person share your values? These are all things that will amplify the compassionate response. And then finally, coping ability. So do you have the ability to sit with your compassion response and tolerate it, even if it might prove a little bit aversive or painful? And this can require things like having sufficient emotional regulation, emotional awareness, having the efficacy to tolerate your compassion and think that you could actively do something to help. So this is generally what many psychologists and social psychologists think compassion is. But I briefly just want to kind of discuss what compassion is not by distinguishing it from related constructs. So compassion isn't theory of mind. It's not the simple act of knowing what someone else is thinking or feeling. It's not the act of actively taking someone's perspective. And it's not simulating or projecting yourself into someone else's shoes. Although all of these things can lead to compassion, And in fact, perspective taking is often used as an induction of compassion. It doesn't have to. I could take the perspective of my arch nemesis. Not that I have one, but if I did, and I took his or her perspective, it's not my wife, maybe it's my son. When he's crying, but it doesn't have to lead to compassion. I could perspective take, but not decide that I want to care and actively want to relieve the suffering of the person whose perspective I'm taking. Perhaps more important, because you see these two terms conflated everywhere, pop articles, scientific articles, everywhere, this is compassion and empathy. And as Emiliana nicely put it, empathy is matching the emotion of someone else. It's a resonance, a mimicry, a contagion. If I see someone feeling sad, feeling angry, I catch that emotion myself. But it doesn't necessarily involve any kind of pro-social component. And compassion you can think about as having a distinct flavor of motivating you to want to actually reach out, approach the person, and relieve his or her suffering. It doesn't help that Batson called compassion empathic concern. It doesn't help that Adam Smith called empathy sympathy. It's always confusing. And again, empathy may not be sufficient or necessary to trigger compassion. I could resonate with someone, I could resonate with a criminal, but doesn't mean I want to actively feel compassion for them. Another related emotional state is something called personal distress. Also arises in the context of helping situations. So it's the anxiety or discomfort that I might feel in response to the suffering of someone else. I see a homeless man on the street and I start to feel bad. And if that badness turns into a self-focus on how bad I'm feeling, the most likely result is that I'm not going to be motivated to help. I'm just going to want to withdraw from the situation in the quickest way possible. So distress distinguishes from compassion in the sense that it has distinct appraisals. It's about yourself rather than the other person, and it has distinct behavioral consequences. Compassion leads to more reliable helping. Just to kind of summarize that, there's this beautiful schematic by Klemecki and Tanya Singer that just kind of suggests a simplified version of how empathy, compassion, and distress might relate to one another. You might have some initial resonant empathic experience with someone else, you catch their emotions, but that could go in a variety of directions. It might lead you to a path of compassion, sympathy, empathic concern, which would lead you to feel perhaps positive, good health, pro-social motivation. If, on the other hand, you turn towards distress, you might get burnt out, have poor health, feel negative, focus on yourself, and just withdraw from the situation in the quickest way possible. Now, there are emotion terms that are in compassion's ballpark that are often used synonymously. You could kind of think about them as kind of family resemblances of one another, but there may be important distinctions to keep in mind. Nussbaum suggests that one way to think about the distinction between compassion and the related term sympathy, which are often used synonymously in the scientific literature, is that sympathy is a less intense form of suffering. Right? So if I might be sympathetic that my friend had a bad day at work, but if my friend lost a loved one, I might feel compassion. I might feel a really deep sense of, a deep motivation to help him feel better. As Emiliana suggested, pity might imply a power relation. So if I feel pity for someone, not only do I feel I want to help them, but with the cognizance that I'm helping you because I can and you are beneath me. Love or loving kindness, you might think, doesn't necessarily require any suffering in the first place. You know, I can love my wife and son, but just because, not because there's any negative event, but just out of sheer appreciation of their existence. And then finally, sadness, you might think, is involving a loss to oneself rather than to someone else. Okay. So any questions thus far? I know I'm moving kind of fast.
Yeah. I have a question. When you talk about compassion versus sympathy, does sympathy require a motivation to want to help others suffering? Is that generally understood as part of sympathy?
I mean, usually when scientists, from my experience, use the term sympathy, it's synonymous with compassion, thought to involve the same motivation to actually relieve the suffering. There hasn't been as clear-cut of a distinction scientifically between those two terms. The compassion versus sympathy thing I presented was more of a philosophical thing presented by Nussbaum, but it's a good question. Yeah, so is compassion an emotion? So can we think about compassion as a mental state, as an emotion? For compassion to qualify, it would need to be an affective state that's built from specific appraisals or judgments that distinguish it from other emotions. And as I've been discussing, it appears that we can think about how compassion would separate from sadness, pity, distress, empathy. But there are lingering ambiguities about what compassion is as an emotion. There's not a set conclusion about what exactly what that means if we say that compassion is an emotion. One of the issues that Emiliana foreshadowed, many affective scientists think that you can think about emotions as a combination of two dimensions, something called valence and arousal. So you can think about emotions as involving kind of being good versus bad, so pleasure versus displeasure, or high or low arousal. It's often described as core affect. And you can think about different discrete emotions like compassion, anger, fear, disgust as falling somewhere along these combinations of how good or bad do you feel and how energetic versus bored do you feel. You might think that compassion is a negative emotion. Aristotle thought that compassion involved feeling pain at the suffering of someone else. You might think that negativity places it somewhere over here, perhaps a high arousal, negatively valenced emotion. But on the other hand, inasmuch as compassion is similar to love and loving kindness, you might think that it has certain positive components that place it more as a positive emotion. So at this point, it's still ambiguous within the affective science literature whether compassion is negative or positive. Yeah?
Could it come from a neutral place?
It could be mixed valence, certainly. It doesn't have to be either or. It could be somewhere in the middle. Definitely. Yeah.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
So, on a flight over here, I was sitting next to someone who was a Buddhist monk. Mm-hmm. Talked about the bandwidths of compassion, and she put fierceness on behalf of others as, as part of that. Mm-hmm. Is in your thinking the antisocial, maybe even things that would make us commit harmful acts towards others on behalf of a suffering other?
Yeah, empathy-induced aggression or something like that.
But to you, that's not compassion.
Yeah, no, that's a
question.
So if I can rephrase it, so if you feel compassion on the behalf of someone else's suffering, if I hear that someone has harmed someone else and I feel compassion for the victim, would the subsequent aggression towards the aggressor be?
The term aggression in that case is not quite nuanced enough to, I think, connect with what is meant by fierce compassion. Because there are many times you will say to a child, you will deny their current wish and seem to them extremely cruel. Right. That is deeply motivated by the long-term view. Right. And this could be a very rich area for our discussion right after the end of this talk. But if we start on it right now, we may run out of time for you. So do you want to finish up and then we'll...
Yeah,
because you've sort of invited everybody in, but we need to get to the end of what you want so we can open it wide up.
All right, cool. Yeah, definitely. I think that one important thing to think about is there may be different forms of compassion. The compassion that we feel in certain contexts might vary quite widely. And just to, I guess, finish up and provide one little last point for discussion, just to complicate things further. Certain models of emotion, what are called constructivist or constructionist models, have a very different viewpoint about what emotions are and what they're built from. So perhaps the most prominent example of this suggests that when you feel a discrete emotion like compassion or disgust, it's an emergent gestalt. It's built from more basic parts. It's built from core affect, which I just showed you in the previous screen, but also situation-specific emotion concepts. So concepts that you have for the emotion in question, for compassion. And that will vary by the context you're in. You might have compassion in relation to someone who's been harmed and that might be related to subsequent fierce behavior. You might have compassion in the context of a homeless individual, in the context of your family. And the specific way that compassion is constituted might change importantly across contexts, such that the compassion may not be unitary. It might be something that's very different depending upon the specific situation in which it emerges. So, compassion is an emotion. We can also ask if it's a moral emotion. And I just briefly want to consider what the science would suggest for answering this, or at least addressing this question. To think about what counts as a moral emotion, you could appeal to antecedents. So moral emotions might be those emotions that arise in the context of moral transgressions. So compassion arises in the context of undeserved harms. But you can also appeal to functional consequences. Compassion influences moral judgments, attitudes, and behaviors. And there's a bevy of research that suggests there are plenty of moral benefits of compassion. It increases, when you induce compassionate states, it increases pro-social behavior. It influences how we think about morality, the strength with which we endorse our moral principles. It can influence judgments of forgiveness and of whether it's okay to kill one person to save many more. It can improve intergroup attitudes and stigmatization. And it can improve cooperation. And for the sake of time, I'm not going to go into it, but Dan Batson's empathy altruism model, which suggests that compassion induces a strong altruistic motivation, is probably the most famous account of compassion within social psychology. And it's shown over the course of the past 3 decades that if you induce a compassionate state, it does appear to induce a legitimate concern of helping the other person, of relieving their suffering, even if you have an easy way to get out without helping.
Can you just say what inducing a compassionate state?
Sure. There's different ways to do it. Some ways that he's used in the past is to think about, so you hear about a victim, you know, Katie Banks, she's lost family members, her parents and her older siblings. She's responsible for taking care of her younger siblings. Think about what she's going through. That's been shown to induce compassion, as opposed to taking a cold, detached perspective on the account of what's happening. Getting people to think that the person in question, the victim in question, has similar values, shares your beliefs, your value structure. Those are a couple of different ways that have been used to induce compassion. But I should point out, just as a kind of another possible source of discussion, this is not uncontroversial. There are plenty of scholars who think that compassion is actually amoral or even immoral, that it can interfere with principles of fairness, say in legal settings. There's actually and I just want to jump to this because I suggest that you all read this, you might get angry when you read it, who knows. Paul Bloom had a recent article in the New Yorker called The Case Against Empathy, which suggests that, and he kind of conflates empathy and compassion, but he suggests that compassion is untrustworthy as a moral guide. It's subject to various in-group biases, it's narrow-minded and superficial, it can't, apparently, according to him, can't be sensitive to the kinds of large crises, the large humanitarian, environmental crises, about which we need to have a strong moral response. So he argues rather eloquently, though I think wrongly, that empathy or compassion leads us astray only when we take it as a moral guide. So I guess I put this up here just in thinking about compassion, what it is, what are its moral functions, just keeping in mind there is a strong contingent out there who thinks that compassion is morally controversial and even problematic. Okay, that's it.
So now we have about 8 minutes for questions. I want to take a moderator prerogative and ask about the parochial effects of oxytocin. So we have oxytocin, this love hormone, you mentioned it, Emiliano. And it's often heightened in the experience of relating closely to another. And people are all over the world beginning to have nasal sprays. We're giving it to people with Asperger's and hoping they have more social attunement. But it also actually makes you better able to detect out-group members. So there's a wonderful issue in, I guess, behavior and immunity. Last year, there's a paper by Dedru that says the parochial effects of oxytocin. So it seems that the extensivity of compassion is actually up against the tribal boundaries. So can you speak from an evolutionary perspective to the efficacy of this kind of structure and ideas to how to potentially overcome it or redefine what we mean by tribe?
What do you mean efficacies of the structure? Which structure?
The evolutionary basis for why it might be adaptive to have this.
Have it set up this. Wouldn't it be better if we could be we take our oxytocin and just love everyone and there would
But we've heard repeatedly evidence that's very clear about the closer you are mapped onto the other, the more likely you're able to arouse a compassionate response.
So, so in thinking about human behavior you have to think, and from an evolutionary perspective, you have to think about motivational conflict almost at the center of everything. What we decide to do is a result of, in our minds, we have reconciled in our brains, we've reconciled this motivational conflict. Our behavior is a result of whatever motivation wins. And all those other motivations are probably still bumping around inside of our bodies. And so when you think about something like what our, the danger of helping others in terms of the danger of those compassionate feelings. Sometimes people think about people who are compassionate as doormats, or if you self-volunteer, how many of us want to self-volunteer as I'm a nice person, that's what I have to, and who are raising their hand and saying I'm a really nice person is going to attract a lot of people who might want to take from the nice person. So that I cannot overemphasize the idea that there is a risk and a danger to a system that just unilaterally devotes resources to others outside the self. So the system itself, the hardwired system, has to be selective. It has to be resistant to engaging. It has to be aware of not just my needs versus your needs, but also your needs versus another person's need. What I give to my friends' children may take away from what I give to my own children. What I give to the kids I'm teaching in school may take away from what I give to my own children. What I do for one coworker may come at the expense of another coworker. That there's the idea that we have unlimited resources is false. But psychologically, we may be able to put ourselves into a position. You asked about circumventing this sort of zero-sum sense. Psychologically, there may be better ways of navigating the motivational conflict amongst others and between ourselves and others that add up in almost a utilitarian way to a net positive for the world. And it may be that some combination of viewing the interdependence that exists among human beings and the structure of communities, which are really made up of different groups. So it's not so scary if I don't do much for my coworker, because my coworker has people they're connected to who are doing things for them. So, if you can think about how you structure things on a societal level, you can almost, I guess what I would say is attempt to reduce the motivational conflict. Mm-hmm. Like, do we have to really take it all on ourselves because our society has thrown us to the wolves and we're responsible for that? Or can we structure societies that are going to make it so we're not choosing between our kids and going to work, and we're not choosing between these 25 kindergartners who they themselves, their parents, are not available, and so now they need me as a teacher in a way that they wouldn't otherwise. So that's my speculation, but this is a wide open
That's great.
Point of discussion.
That's
really great.
That's really a deep contribution. Questions?
Hi, my name is Mariah, and this is a question for Emiliana. Others can comment if they want, of course. So I want to go back to your definition or characterization of compassion as the feeling that arises when you encounter another person's suffering and are motivated to help. And I'm curious about how much continuity there is between the idea of encountering someone suffering at one moment, which is now, let's say. How much continuity is there between that and the anticipation of potential future suffering for anybody that could be averted through a preventive orientation, right? So if you care about witnessing, say, an unnecessary death in childbirth, and you gosh, I couldn't have helped that person, but we can do a lot more to improve maternal care, right? Do you see that as an extension of compassion, or what's your sense of the relation between present and future in this definition?
That's a great question. I don't think I mean encounter as necessarily a physical proximal experience. Like you have to be in the encounter can be a thought about a potential future vulnerability or suffering that you might consider avoiding. We can encounter in a sort of a reliving way our compassion towards or the suffering of the family. Again, sorry, because the top of my mind, the family of Trayvon Martin. Right, we can encounter that without those people being in the room in front of us, and we can consider deeply, like, how can we change something about our own lives or about the structure of our society, such that the kinds of thoughts or problems that contributed to that tragedy are less likely or less. Less likely. So yeah, I don't mean encounter, and you have to physically be there. I think encounter is just in the process of considering someone's deep suffering, as well as being in the presence of deep suffering.
Paul Ekman has been writing about different kinds of compassion, proximal and distal and global and heroic, as one heuristic to begin to understand that people are deeply motivated. So we know about compassionate motivation that could set up a career choice. So while you're studying for the MCAT, if you want to become a physician, it doesn't really feel like you're practicing compassion. But I think it's really important to take a multi-tiered, multi-timescale approach. And Arlene Salmon, who runs One Heart, which actually goes to rural Nepal and many other countries in Tibet, which with $7 in material saves lives of women and children who give birth on the ground in dirt with these birth kits, has extraordinary compassionate motivation, even though she lives in Marin County.
Yeah, Chris Mason, I'm reflecting on the concept of dangers or the negativity and thinking about such things as overprotectiveness and tough love, and how sometimes when we do for others, they don't really have the opportunity then to learn what they need to learn so that they become stronger and more self-sufficient. And wondering, from your research and your thoughts, where you think we should go with some of these ideas.
I guess I'll feel that. Definitely, defensiveness is something that can shut down affiliative motivation. And I think the fear of compassion as a construct will probably come up at some point during the conference. But this idea that some people may have had negative experiences with attachment figures from a young age, or maybe they tried to help someone but got burned. So negative emotion and affect got tagged to the compassion experience. So when they think about whether to help someone, whether to open themselves with compassion and take the risk of doing so, they may feel that it's not worth it and back away accordingly.
I think what she's talking about is perhaps Barbara Oaks calls pathologic altruism, where you actually do an act which, while nominally is helping someone, actually makes them more dependent and not.
Yeah, that's called afflictive compassion from the Buddhist perspective.
Also thinking about different levels, and as your awareness of compassion increases, and you go through stages of learning about compassion, which I think is part of what happens as we mature. Sometimes, that in fact at one stage you may end up, exhibiting one type of compassion, which may be good in the short term, but not for the longer term.
So I actually think that that issue, our brains are really, really attuned to whether what we're getting is matching the need that we have, which shows that the other person really cares about us, or whether it's more than the need we have, which shows that they care more about them, that they care more about themselves, or less than the need we have, which tells us that they don't care so much about us. And then I think when you talk about short-term versus long-term, that whether you transition into a truly interdependent relationship is really what's at stake, and whether that turns into a bond. And so even though we may see these pathological situations develop or one-sided dependence develop, somehow our bodies know that it's not quite enough to release this more, sort of hardwired affiliative system.
We'll have the last question over here because we're at time.
Actually kind of connecting to that, it's more of a addition than a question, but I was having the same conversation with my teacher, the Rinpoche that I study under, last summer about compassion in my own meditation practice and the feeling of where is that line between being kind to someone and being compassionate to someone, that they're not the same thing. And he just looked at me and was very clear and said, compassion is not always soft. And compassion is not being a doormat. Because again, oftentimes compassion can even manifest as yelling at someone or as setting firm boundaries. Because it's not always giving what someone needs in the moment or what someone wants in the moment or meeting their needs. And that a lot of different acts can actually fall under the umbrella of compassion. It's about the motivation behind it and where that's coming from. So it's not science, not research. But.
So did you have something more to add, or this is it? Thank you very much.